great left jab. But what made him more special than anything was the intestinal fortitude. He was tough as nails.
A representative for Tyson says he experienced a flare-up from an ulcer, but is now recovering.
Staff kicks an elderly man out of the store, but they're left speechless when Mike Tyson walks in and demands answers. The glass doors of Midtown Community Bank trembled as they swung open. Martin Carter's hands, calloused from decades of work as a mechanic, gripped his cane tighter. His steps were slow, deliberate, but his heart was racing. Two security guards flanked him, their hands resting lightly on his elbows, ushering him toward the exit. His shoes scuffed against the polished tile floor, the sound echoing in the quiet tension of the bank lobby. "Sir, like I said, there are no exceptions," the bank teller called after him, her voice firm, but not unkind. "Without digital verification, we can't access your account." Martin turned, his lined face tight with frustration and desperation. "I've been banking here for 30 years. You know me. Miss Carroll used to help me. She knew my name, my story. She knew me." His voice cracked slightly, but he steadied it, unwilling to let them see him crumble. Martin hesitated at the threshold, his eyes scanning the modern, impersonal bank lobby, a stark contrast to the warmth he once knew there. He whispered to himself, more to the memory of Miss Carroll than to anyone present. Stay tuned to find out how one man takes on the system in a fight for dignity and connection. In his hands, he clutched a stack of papers, bills, identification cards, and a dog-eared pension statement. The papers slipped from his trembling grip, scattering across the floor like fallen leaves. As Martin bent down to pick them up, his back protested, sharp pain shooting up his spine. A few customers moved to help, but the guards held up their hands. "Sir, you're causing a scene," one of them said. Martin's voice rose, raw with emotion. "My wife needs her medicine. The pharmacy closes in an hour. Please, I just need to withdraw my money." His weathered face crumpled, tears pooling in his eyes, but refusing to fall. Outside the bank's floor-to-ceiling windows, pedestrians slowed. Their curiosity increased. Phones appeared, cameras clicking on. The bank became tense, and the hushed murmurs of the customers turned into a mix of discomfort and outrage. In the corner, a young teller whispered to her colleague, "This isn't right. The man just needs his money." An elderly woman near the front nodded, muttering to herself, "This is just cruel." Just as the guards reached for Martin's arm to guide him out, the heavy glass door swung open again. In walked a man whose presence seemed to command the entire room without him uttering a word. Mike Tyson, the former heavyweight champion, strode in with the ease of someone who had spent years in the public eye. He was dressed simply, a gray sweatshirt and jeans, but his face, familiar to nearly everyone present, turned every head. At his side was his teenage son, Amir, who paused mid-step when he spotted Martin on the bench near the entrance. "Dad," Amir said quietly, tugging on Mike's sleeve. "Something's wrong with that guy." Mike's sharp eyes followed his son's gaze. Martin sat hunched over, his head in his hands, papers crumpled at his feet. His cane leaned precariously against the bench, and his shoulders shook with silent sobs. Mike approached slowly, his voice low and calm. "Hey man, you all right?" Martin looked up, startled, hastily wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I'm fine," he said gruffly, but his voice betrayed him. Amir crouched down, gathering the scattered papers. His young face softened as he read through them. A prescription slip, an old social security letter, and a worn photo of a younger Martin with a smiling woman. "Sir," Amir said, holding out the papers, "is this about your wife?" Martin hesitated before nodding. "She needs her medication. It's expensive. I came here to withdraw the money, but they won't let me. Something about not having the right phone or app. I don't even understand half of what they're saying." Mike's face hardened. "They wouldn't let you take out your own money?" Martin shook his head, his voice heavy with resignation. "They said it's some new policy. Everything's online now. I don't have one of those fancy phones. I've been coming here for decades, but today, that doesn't seem to matter." Mike stood up, his jaw tightening. He'd seen a lot in his life, fights in and out of the ring, but there was something about this scene that struck a nerve. Maybe it was the way Martin's hands trembled. Maybe it was the photograph of the smiling woman, her eyes bright with hope. Or maybe it was the quiet way Martin's dignity seemed to be slipping away, piece by piece. "Come on," Mike said, extending a hand to Martin. "Let's fix this." Martin hesitated. "I don't want to cause trouble." Mike's lips twitched into a small smile. Sometimes trouble's exactly what you need to get things done. Together, they walked back into the bank, Amir trailing behind them, still clutching the stack of papers. The room fell silent again, the weight of the moment palpable. Rebecca Hayes, the bank manager, was mid-sentence with a customer when she spotted them. She froze, her professional mask slipping for just a moment. She recognized Mike Tyson immediately. Who didn't? "Mr. Tyson," she said, her voice cautious but polite. "How can we help you today?" Mike gestured toward Martin. "You can start by giving this man his money." Rebecca glanced at Martin, then back at Mike. "I understand there's a situation here, but we have strict policies, without digital verification." Mike cut her off, his voice firm but not loud. "I'm not here for excuses. This man's been banking with you for years, and now you're telling him he can't access his own money because he doesn't have the right technology? That's ridiculous." Rebecca straightened, her professionalism returning. "I sympathize, but these policies are in place to protect our customers, especially seniors. There's been a rise in fraud. And what about the people who get left behind?" Mike shot back. "You're so busy protecting numbers on a screen, you've forgotten there's a real person standing here. A person who trusted you with his life savings." The room was dead silent. Customers leaned in, some recording the exchange on their phones. Rebecca hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She glanced at her computer, where Martin's account information was still open. Decades of steady deposits, no overdrafts, no suspicious activity. "You're right," she said finally, her voice softer. "We'll make an exception this time." She motioned for a teller to process the withdrawal. Martin's eyes widened in relief, and his grip on his cane loosened slightly. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't know what this means to me." Mike clapped him on the back, a small smile breaking through his serious expression. "Sometimes you gotta fight for what's right, even outside the ring." As Martin pocketed the cash, Rebecca met Mike's eyes. "We'll review our policies," she promised, her tone earnest. "This shouldn't have happened." Mike nodded. "Good, because banking's supposed to be about people, not just policies." Outside, as they stepped into the fading afternoon light, Martin turned to Mike. "I don't know how to thank you." Mike waved him off. "Don't worry about it. Just take care of your wife." Amir chimed in, a grin spreading across his face. "And maybe teach me that move you used to win those championships." Martin chuckled for the first time that day, a sound that seemed to lighten the air around them. "Deal, kid. Deal." And as they parted ways, Martin walked a little taller, his dignity restored, his faith in people rekindled. Sometimes it wasn't about the rules. Sometimes it was about remembering that behind every rule, there's a person who matters. As Martin disappeared down the sidewalk, a quiet sense of triumph lingered in the air. But what happens when the fight isn't over? Stay tuned. As Walter clutched the cash envelope in his trembling hands, a quiet moment passed. He glanced at Mike Tyson, whose imposing figure stood like a fortress beside him. "You didn't have to do this, Mr. Tyson," Walter said softly, his voice weighed down by gratitude and years of unspoken exhaustion. Mike gave a faint smile, the kind that didn't quite touch his eyes. "Call me Mike," he said. "And yeah, I did have to. You see, when I was a kid, there were people like you, folks who cared when no one else did. The least I can do is give that back." Walter nodded, overwhelmed. The two men walked out of the bank together, followed closely by a small crowd. The sunlight felt sharper now, warmer even, as if some cosmic injustice had been slightly corrected. A few people clapped quietly, while others snapped photos or whispered into their phones. "Let's get you to that pharmacy," Mike said, waving over a black SUV with tinted windows. Walter hesitated for a moment, looking down at his worn shoes, but Mike nudged him gently. "Come on, Mr. Thompson. We're on a schedule, remember?" The SUV pulled up, and the driver quickly stepped out to open the door. Walter climbed in, settling his cane on his lap as Mike slid in beside him. "To Anderson's drugstore," Mike instructed the driver. Inside the pharmacy, the pharmacist, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, recognized Walter immediately. "Mr. Thompson," she said, "I was worried you wouldn't make it. You're cutting it close, huh?" Her tone was warm, but there was an undercurrent of concern. Walter smiled faintly. "I had some trouble at the bank," he admitted. Mike, standing a few feet behind, added, "But we're here now. Let's get him what he needs." His tone brooked no delay, and the pharmacist nodded quickly, disappearing into the back to retrieve the medication. Walter leaned on his cane, looking around the small pharmacy. It was filled with familiar items. Shelves of over-the-counter medicine, greeting cards, and small snacks. It felt like a sanctuary compared to the cold, clinical atmosphere of the bank. When the pharmacist returned, she handed over a small bag with the medication. "This is the new regimen, right? Let me know if you or Margaret have any questions," she said, her concern genuine. Walter nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Miss Anderson. You've always been good to us." Mike paid for the prescription before Walter could even reach into his pocket. "This one's on me," he said firmly, holding up a hand to silence Walter's protests. "You focus on taking care of Margaret." Back in the car, as they drove Walter home, the old man finally spoke. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know how I can ever repay you." Mike leaned back in his seat, looking out the window for a moment before turning to Walter. "You already did." The SUV pulled up to Walter's small, modest home. The lawn was neatly trimmed, but the paint on the house was peeling, and the front steps sagged slightly. Mike helped Walter out of the car, steadying him as he climbed the steps. "Margaret," Walter called softly as he opened the door. Inside, the house was warm and lived in, filled with framed photos and the faint smell of lavender. Margaret, a frail woman with a knitted blanket draped over her shoulders, looked up from the couch. Her face lit up when she saw Walter, though her expression quickly turned to concern as she noticed the strain on his features. "What happened?" she asked, her voice weak but urgent. Walter waved a hand dismissively. "Nothing we can't handle," he said, his voice carrying a note of reassurance. He handed her the pharmacy bag, his eyes glistening with relief. "We got it." Margaret's eyes flickered to Mike, standing silently near the doorway. "And who do we have to thank for that?" she asked, her tone soft but grateful. Mike stepped forward, offering a small, almost shy smile. Just someone who was in the right place at the right time. But what Mike Tyson did next took everyone by surprise. As Mike left Walter and Margaret's home, he couldn't shake the image of the couple from his mind. The love and resilience they shared reminded him of his own struggles, of the people who had shown him kindness when he was at his lowest. He pulled out his phone and typed a quick message to his publicist. "Find out what we can do for Walter Thompson and his wife." Quietly. No press. His driver gave him a curious glance as they pulled away from the curb. "Everything okay, boss?" Mike nodded, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "Yeah," he said, "just thinking about how we can fix what's broken." The SUV disappeared down the street, leaving behind a neighborhood that felt, at least for a moment, a little brighter. A week later, Walter received a phone call from the bank. The voice on the other end was not Rebecca Stevens, but someone much higher up, a regional manager apologizing profusely for the ordeal. A new policy was being implemented, he explained, to better accommodate seniors and those without digital access. Walter listened quietly, unsure of what to say. Later that evening, a letter arrived. Inside was a personal note from Mike Tyson, along with a check to cover Margaret's medical expenses for the next 6 months. "For Margaret," the note read, "and for every kid who learned more than basketball from Mr. Thompson." Walter sat in his favorite chair, staring at the letter. For the first time in weeks, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Walter sat back in his chair, his arthritic fingers tracing the edges of Mike's letter. The words felt heavy, yet comforting, a reminder that kindness could still cut through the noise of bureaucracy and rules. Across the room, Margaret smiled weakly, holding the small prescription bottle in her hands. "That man," she whispered, her voice frail but steady. "He's more than just a boxer. He's got a heart." Walter nodded, his mind replaying the events of the past few days. "Sometimes, Margaret," he said, "help comes from the places you least expect it." Walter looked out the window, the evening sun casting a golden hue over the quiet street. He folded the letter carefully and placed it on the table beside him. "Sometimes," he murmured to himself, "it's not about the punches you throw, it's about the hands you extend." The doorbell rang just as Walter was settling into his breakfast routine. He shuffled to the door, cane tapping softly against the wooden floor. When he opened it, a delivery man stood there holding a medium-sized box and an envelope. "Mr. Thompson?" the man asked, glancing at the address. "Yes, that's me. These are for you. Have a good day." The man tipped his cap and walked back to his truck, leaving Walter to stare at the package in confusion. He brought the items inside and placed them on the table. Margaret watched from her spot on the couch, curiosity lighting up her pale features. "Well, what is it?" she asked. Walter opened the envelope first. Inside was a card with a simple note: "Let's make things easier." It wasn't signed, but Walter recognized the bold, slightly messy handwriting. Mike. The box revealed a brand new smartphone, preloaded with a basic, easy-to-use banking app. There was also a printed instruction manual written in large, legible font, with step-by-step directions. At the bottom of the box was a handwritten note. "Call this number if you need help. My daughter Maya will walk you through it. She's a tech whiz." Margaret chuckled softly as Walter held up the sleek device. "Looks like you're stepping into the 21st century, whether you like it or not." Walter shook his head, smiling. That man doesn't know when to stop helping, does he? Meanwhile, Rebecca Stevens sat in her office, staring at her computer screen. The past week had been a whirlwind. Corporate had conducted an internal review, sending a stern reminder about balancing policy enforcement with customer care. Rebecca's name had circulated in industry discussions, not as a scapegoat, but as a cautionary tale. She sighed, leaning back in her chair. The encounter with Mike Tyson and Walter had shaken her confidence, but it had also opened her eyes. "Miss Stevens," one of the tellers said, poking her head into the office, "there's a gentleman here to see you. He asked for you by name." Rebecca's stomach tightened. She stepped into the lobby, her heels clicking against the polished floor. There, standing with his usual stoic demeanor, was Mike Tyson. "Mr. Tyson," she said, trying to maintain her composure. "What can I do for you today?" Mike crossed his arms, his presence commanding. And what he said next would change everything. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I just wanted to make sure Mr. Thompson is taken care of." Rebecca nodded. "We've made adjustments," she said. "I personally ensured his account was updated. And I'm sorry for how things were handled before." Mike studied her for a moment before giving a small nod. "Good," he said. "Because people like Mr. Thompson, they're the backbone of communities. And if a bank forgets that, it's not just bad business. It's wrong." Rebecca looked down, a flicker of guilt crossing her face. "You're right," she admitted. "I've been too focused on following rules and not enough on people." Mike softened slightly. "It's a lesson for all of us," he said. "Just don't forget it." Over the next few weeks, Walter settled into using the new smartphone. Maya, Mike's daughter, called regularly to guide him through the process, her patience endless as Walter asked questions. "I didn't think I'd ever figure this thing out," Walter admitted one day during a call. "You're doing great, Mr. Thompson," Maya said. Margaret, meanwhile, grew stronger with each passing day. The new medication seemed to be working, and Walter's relief was visible. He even started spending more time in the community, reconnecting with former friends who had seen the viral videos of his ordeal. "Mr. Thompson, you're famous now," one of his former players teased at a local diner. "The internet loves you." Walter waved it off. "I'm just glad things worked out," he said. "That's all that matters." Walter turned to Mike, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "And you, Mike, you reminded me that even when life feels too big to handle, there's always someone willing to step in and help." Mike smiled, a rare warmth in his usually guarded expression. "We're all just a team, Mr. Thompson," he said. "And a good team takes care of its own." In the end, Walter's story became more than just a viral moment. It became a proof of the power of community, compassion, and the simple acts that remind us we're not alone in this world.